The 10 popes with the longest pontificates in history. Number 10. Pope Gregory XIII, pontificate of 20 years, 10 months and 28 days, May 13, 1572 to April 10, 1585. Ugo Boncompagni, elected Gregory XIII, was an intellectual pope, political strategist, and tireless reformer, whose mark was forever imprinted on universal history, thanks to one of his most emblematic decisions, the reform of the calendar. Born in Bologna, his legal and theological training prepared him to rigorously confront the challenges of a church emerging from the deep wounds left by the Protestant Reformation. From the beginning of his pontificate in 1572, he demonstrated a strong will to strengthen papal authority, promote Catholic education, and restore the lost spiritual unity in Europe. He created numerous seminaries, promoted universities, and actively supported the expansion of Catholic missions in Asia and America in an attempt to counter Protestant influence with pedagogy and faith. However, his most famous legacy was the introduction of the Gregorian calendar in 1582, a scientific and liturgical reform that replaced the old Julian calendar and is used today in much of the world. To correct the accumulated astronomical discrepancies, Gregory XIII decreed the elimination of 10 days from the calendar and established new rules for leap years. This measure not only had religious implications, such as the precise determination of Easter, but also civil and cultural consequences that resonated for centuries. Throughout his nearly 21-year pontificate, he maintained an active policy in European affairs, intervening in wars, crowns, and alliances to preserve Catholicism. His long reign represents a synthesis of intelligence, power, and global influence in an era when the papacy was once again projecting itself as a central actor in history. Number 9. Pope Leo I, the Great, pontificate of 21 years, 1 month and 13 days, September 29, 440 to November 10, 461. Leo I, known as Leo the Great, was one of the greatest pontiffs in history, and the first to officially receive the title of Great for his theological, pastoral, and diplomatic merits. Born in the region of Tuscany, he came to the throne of St. Peter at a time of extreme weakness for the Western Roman Empire, beset by barbarian invasions, internal schisms, and growing political destabilization. From the beginning of his pontificate, Leo aimed to restore the moral and doctrinal authority of the Bishop of Rome as a central figure in universal Christianity. His firmness, intelligence, and eloquence made him a key figure in consolidating the primacy of the papacy over other ecclesiastical sees in the East. He was the first pope to clearly define the doctrine of Christ's dual nature in his famous Epistle to Flavian, the basis of the Council of Chalcedon. His legacy transcended theology and extended into the military and political spheres. In 452, he became the protagonist of one of the most legendary episodes of the papacy, the encounter with Attila the Hun. When Rome was defenseless against the advancing Hunnic hordes, Leo personally appeared before the barbarian leader and, through a negotiation still shrouded in mystery, managed to convince him not to sack the city. 3 years later, in 455, he was unable to prevent the Vandals' sacking, but intervened again to minimize the violence against civilians and temples. His pontificate of more than 2 decades consolidated the figure of the Pope as a spiritual guide and defender of the Christian order. Leo the Great transformed the papacy into an active and central institution in the politics of his time, leaving a model of leadership that would influence for centuries. Number 8. Pope Sylvester I pontificate of 21 years, 11 months and 0 days, January 31st, 314 to December 31st, 335. Sylvester I was the first pope to minister under an officially Christian empire, following the Edict of Milan in 313, which legalized the Christian faith thanks to Emperor Constantine. Although his pontificate coincided with one of the most important transformations in the history of Christianity, its transition from a persecuted religion to a faith protected by the state, his role has traditionally been discreet in official documents. Nevertheless, his reign was long, stable, and deeply symbolic. Under his leadership, construction began on the first great Christian basilicas in Rome, such as St. John Lateran, St. Peter's in the Vatican, and St. Paul outside the walls, monuments that marked the beginning of monumental Christianity. Sylvester I thus became the first bishop of Rome to see Christianity emerge from the catacombs and rise as a visible, public force in the heart of the empire. Although he did not personally participate in the Council of Nicaea in 325, which defined the consubstantiality of the Son with the Father, he did send representatives in his name, thus demonstrating the growing doctrinal authority of the papacy. His pontificate, which lasted for nearly 22 years, represented a turning point between the age of the martyrs and the imperial era of the Church. During his reign, liturgical practices that endured for centuries were also introduced, such as the consecration of churches and the organization of ecclesiastical administration in Rome. Later tradition attributed miracles and legendary feats to him, including the dubious donation of Constantine, which portrayed him as the recipient of the temporal power of the empire, although historically this is a medieval forgery. However, beyond the myth, Sylvester I embodied the transition from oppressed Christianity to triumphant Christianity, and his long pontificate was the symbol of that new order. Number 7. Pope Alexander III, pontificate of 21 years, 11 months, and 23 days. September 7th, 1159 to August 30th, 1181. Rolando Bandinelli, who adopted the name Alexander III upon being elected pope, is remembered as one of the most resilient popes in history. His election in 1159 was immediately contested by a faction of cardinals who, supported by Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa, proclaimed Victor IV antipope. What followed was a prolonged and tense struggle of nearly 2 decades between Alexander and imperial power, marked by exile, resistance, and tenacity. Alexander III not only survived 4 antipopes imposed by the emperor, but also managed to maintain his legitimacy among most European kingdoms, thanks to a network of diplomatic alliances woven with intelligence and astuteness. He was a defender of the principle of the Church's independence from secular power, and a key player in the consolidation of papal authority vis-à-vis the empire. During his long pontificate, Alexander III presided over the Third Lateran Council in 1179, which established important ecclesiastical reforms, such as limiting the right to vote in conclaves exclusively to cardinals, which strengthened internal control of the Church and sought to prevent future imperial interference. He also condemned simony, promoted the education of the clergy, and reaffirmed papal primacy over all churches. His influence was so decisive that even after years of conflict, he managed to convince Frederick Barbarossa to bow down to him in the famous Peace of Venice in 1177. Alexander III not only resisted, but emerged stronger, and his pontificate set precedents that would be fundamental to the development of the medieval papacy. His long reign was proof that spiritual steadfastness could successfully challenge the greatest earthly powers. Number 6. Pope Pius VII, pontificate of 23 years, 5 months, and 6 days. March 14, 1800 to August 20, 1823. Barnaba Chiaramonti, elected Pius VII, assumed the pontificate during one of the most dramatic moments in European history, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the total reconfiguration of the continental political map. After the hasty conclave held in Venice due to the French occupation of Rome, his election in 1800 symbolized both spiritual continuity and the need to adapt to a world in turmoil. Pius VII was a prudent pope, firm but conciliatory, who understood the need for dialogue with the new power that emerged after the French Revolution. His main diplomatic achievement was the signing of the Concordat of 1801 with Napoleon, which partially restored the Church in France and allowed for a degree of religious stability, albeit under harsh conditions imposed by the emperor. However, that relationship soon turned contentious. Pius VII refused to give in to the abuses of the Napoleonic regime, especially when Napoleon demanded greater control over episcopal appointments. In 1809, the Pope was arrested and deported to France, remaining a prisoner for 5 years in Savona and Fontainebleau. Despite his imprisonment, he refused to abdicate and wrote clandestine letters to maintain the rule of the Church. When Napoleon fell in 1814, Pius VII returned triumphantly to Rome, where he was received as a living symbol of spiritual resistance. In addition to restoring ecclesiastical authority, he promoted religious education, reorganized religious orders, and defended papal dignity against the powers of the Congress of Vienna. His long pontificate showed how faith could be sustained even in the midst of war, exile, and humiliation. He was the pastor who not only outlived the emperor, but also publicly forgave him. Number 5. Pope Hadrian I Pontificate of 23 years, 10 months, and 16 days. February 1st, 772 to December 25th, 795. Hadrian I ascended the throne of St. Peter during a decisive period for the future of the papacy, marked by constant Lombard threats, the weakening of the Byzantine Empire in the West, and the rise of Frankish power in Europe. From the beginning of his pontificate, he proved to be a skilled politician and a relentless defender of the Church's independence. One of his most significant acts was his alliance with Charlemagne, whom he requested military aid against the aggressive expansion of the Lombard king Desiderius. This alliance, consolidated through joint campaigns and strategic agreements, became one of the most enduring and influential bonds in medieval history, laying the foundations for the future Holy Roman Empire. Under Hadrian, the papacy ceased to depend on Byzantium and began to forge a new relationship with Frankish power, with Rome as the spiritual axis of the West. During his nearly 24 years of rule, Hadrian I strengthened the administrative structure of the Papal States, restored churches, beautified Rome, and protected church properties from abuses by the local nobility. Doctrinally, he firmly upheld orthodoxy against the heresy of adoptionism and maintained a staunch defense of the worship of sacred images, in opposition to Byzantine iconoclasm. His correspondence with Charlemagne bears witness to an increasingly active and articulate papal diplomacy. When the Pope died in 795, his figure was so highly respected that he was honored with an epitaph composed by the Frankish emperor himself. His long pontificate not only consolidated the temporal power of the papacy, but also reconfigured the political map of Europe, transforming the figure of the Pope into a key player in the continent's new Christian order. Number 4. Pope Pius VI, Pontificate of 24 years, 6 months, and 14 days. February 15th, 1775 to August 29th, 1799. Giovanni Angelo Braschi, elected Pius VI, was the last pope of the 18th century and the first to directly confront the ideological onslaughts of the Enlightenment, rationalism, and, later, the French Revolution. His election in 1775 was celebrated for his elegance, diplomacy, and artistic sensibility. However, his long pontificate was soon mired in a succession of crises that challenged the spiritual and temporal authority of the papacy. Pius VI witnessed the collapse of the Old Order, facing the suppression of the Jesuits, Josephinist decrees in Austria, and a wave of secularization promoted by Enlightenment monarchs. His policy was energetic, but prudent. He sought dialogue, defended the prerogatives of the Church, and promoted beauty as a path to the divine, restoring monuments, promoting the arts, and defending the Roman legacy. But the most devastating blow came with the outbreak of the French Revolution. Pius VI condemned the civil constitution of the clergy and the execution of Louis XVI, which made him a symbolic enemy of the new Republican regime. In 1798, Napoleonic troops invaded Rome, proclaimed the Roman Republic, and arrested the pontiff, who was taken prisoner through Italian territory until he died in Valence, France in 1799, far from the Vatican and as a captive. His death marked an unprecedented event. It was the first time in modern history that a pope had died as a prisoner of a foreign power. His pontificate, the longest since ancient times, symbolized the agony of an era and the resilience of the papacy in the face of a world that was beginning to violently detach itself from its Christian roots. He was a tragic, solemn, and profoundly humane pope facing the end of a civilization. Number 3. Pope Leo XIII, Pontificate of 25 years, 5 months, and 1 day. February 20th, 1878 to July 20th, 1903. Gioacchino Pecci, known as Leo XIII, was a pope who marked the transition between the 19th century church, still embroiled in struggles with modern states, and the social thought that would define Catholicism in the 20th century. His election in 1878, after the death of Pius IX, was met with some skepticism due to his advanced age. However, his pontificate proved to be one of the most influential and long-lived in history, spanning more than 25 years. Leo XIII was the first pope to adopt a decidedly dialogic attitude toward the modern world. He embraced scientific thought, promoted intellectual openness in seminaries and universities, and faced the challenges of liberalism, socialism, and secularism, not with harsh condemnations, but with philosophical reflection and profound theological arguments. His vision was that of a church that did not combat modernity, but rather interpreted it through Christian reason. Leo XIII's most transcendent legacy was the encyclical Rerum Novarum, 1891, considered the founding letter of the Church's social doctrine. In it, he addressed the problem of workers, justice and labor relations, and the dignity of human labor, condemning both savage capitalism and Marxist collectivism. This encyclical transformed the way the Church related to economic and social affairs, marking a turning point in its commitment to the working world. Furthermore, it promoted the study of St. Thomas Aquinas as a pillar of Catholic thought, restored interrupted diplomatic relations, and fostered a more accessible and less isolated papacy. Leo XIII not only governed wisely for more than a quarter of a century, but also prepared the Church to enter the contemporary era with a renewed, pastoral, and deeply human face. Number 2. Pope John Paul II. Pontificate of 26 years, 5 months, and 18 days. October 16, 1978 to April 2, 2005. Karol Józef Wojtyła, known as John Paul II, was the first non-Italian pope in over 450 years, and one of the most charismatic, well-traveled, and influential in contemporary history. His election in 1978 was a true surprise. A Polish cardinal, trained in the cultural resistance against communism, a poet, philosopher, and athlete who ascended to the throne of St. Peter at just 58 years old. From the beginning, his papacy was distinguished by unusual energy. He traveled the world like no pontiff before him, visiting more than 120 countries and bringing his message to millions of people on every continent. He was a global pastor, a symbol of hope for the persecuted, and a key figure in the fall of the Soviet bloc, especially for his decisive support of the Solidarity movement in his native Poland, which made him a threat to the atheistic communism that dominated Eastern Europe. During his more than 26 years of pontificate, he published 14 encyclicals, convened synods, beatified and canonized thousands of people, and reformed the catechism of the Catholic Church. He was also a staunch defender of human dignity, life from conception, and interreligious dialogue. He visited synagogues and mosques and promoted understanding with other faiths like never before. He survived an attack in 1981 that left him seriously injured and, far from weakening him, transformed him into a symbol of Christian forgiveness. In his later years, afflicted with Parkinson's disease, he continued his ministry with a moving witness of suffering offered with love. His death in April 2005 shocked the entire world and was followed by millions. John Paul II was not only a spiritual leader, he was a protagonist of modern history, whose voice resonated powerfully amidst humanity's great moral dilemmas. Number 1. Pope Pius IX, Pontificate of 31 years, 7 months, and 23 days. June 16, 1846 to February 7, 1878. Giovanni Maria Mastai Ferretti, elected Pius IX, led the longest pontificate in the history of the Catholic Church, governing for more than 31 years. His figure represents a true bridge between two eras. He began his papacy as a liberal reformer, admired by the progressive movements of his time, and ended it as a staunch defender of traditionalism and papal authority in its most absolute form. At the beginning of his reign, he promoted civil liberties, political amnesties, and reforms within the papal states. However, following the revolutions of 1848, which forced him to flee Rome, and the progressive loss of the Church's temporal power, his thinking radicalized, taking a firm stance against the challenges of liberalism, Italian nationalism, and the emerging secularism in Europe. Pius IX's doctrinal legacy was monumental. In 1854, he proclaimed the dogma of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, and in 1869 he convened the First Vatican Council, which defined the dogma of papal infallibility in matters of faith and morals. Furthermore, in 1864, he published the controversial Syllabus Errorum, a compendium of condemnations against the errors of the modern world. During his pontificate, the Church's temporal power was lost with the annexation of Rome by the Kingdom of Italy in 1870, leading him to declare himself a prisoner in the Vatican, a position the papacy would maintain for almost 60 years. Pius IX was canonized in 2000 by John Paul II, although his figure continues to generate debate among admirers and critics. His extremely long reign defined much of the identity of the contemporary papacy, strongly shaping both the spirituality and ecclesial politics of the modern era.
Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Give it a like, comment your thoughts, and share this video with your friends and family.